Thank you very much for the invitation to present on this. I'm going to talk quite briefly about some aspects of dissemination from a very Cochrane point of view, and perhaps ironically, given the content of what we've just seen of brilliant ways of visually presenting network meta-analysis, ways of presenting quite briefly when you don't have recourse to figures and other visual methods. I think I was asked to do this because we produced a podcast for Cochrane of an NMA that we at the Wounds Group at Manchester published about 2 years ago in a very messy area of wound research, and that was quite challenging. Sorry, I'm just having trouble moving to my next slide. There we go. So Cochrane podcasts are very short, is the first thing to say. As you can see from this, the duration of this is 3 minutes, 25 seconds. And some of that is someone introducing me and then wrapping up at the end. So you have about 400 words, and obviously it's audio only. It all has to be in the words. Now that can be quite challenging for any review, but I think with a network meta-analysis, whereas we've seen Andrea brilliantly illustrating how to present it visually, it can be particularly difficult. The other thing I would say is to think very much about your audience. We want to make this accessible to a wide range of people, and even if your audience may be primarily clinical or allied health professionals, very often in the case of Cochrane Wounds, don't assume your listeners or your readers are very familiar with what an NMA is. We submitted to a clinical journal just this last Christmas, and this was some of the peer review that we got back. You know, from someone who I assume was a clinician, saying, please provide a succinct description of what an NMA is. So you are having to go in with the assumption that people may not know at all what methodology you might have used. And I think it can be very helpful coming from that perspective to get feedback from a range of readers on your podcast script. We were very lucky in that we had someone who was doing an internship with us and subsequently became an author on a normal Cochrane review. So she was coming in from a nursing background, and she went through multiple drafts of this with us, which was enormously helpful in getting it pitched right in a way that was accessible. Because you have twin challenges. You have limited space and a need for non-technical language, while also presenting something that necessarily has complexity of methods and may well have complexity of results. This is the network diagram shown of the review that we were doing the podcast on. And the colours just indicate the risk of bias associated with the direct evidence. But you can see it's a sparse, disparate network of with 25 different treatments, and summarising both what we did and what we found in 400 words was really quite challenging. So the approach, there are possible approaches, which are to very briefly explain the question and why you needed a network, which can be as simple as saying there are many different possible treatments and they haven't all been compared in trials. Focusing very clearly on what your take-home message from the network is, even if it's one of uncertainty, especially perhaps if it's one of uncertainty. And very much don't feel you have to summarize your whole abstract or your whole summary of findings table. It's just not possible, and you're not going to be able to. So focus on the comparisons that are going to be most clinically relevant, perhaps in relation to any existing guidance or in relation to a widely used reference standard. And if you were able to find clear messages in your treatment rankings, pick out the ones that from those that are clearest and most relevant to your clinical audience, or perhaps to your consumer audience. So for your 400 words, you want to think about what the condition is, what the available treatments are, and very importantly, what your outcome is and why you pick that outcome. In our case, it's complete healing because that matters most to patients. So you can say very simply, we did a network meta-analysis to simultaneously compare multiple treatments across different studies, and that will be sufficient to say why you were doing what you were doing. A very brief line about the quantity of evidence you found and how much of it you were able to put into your network. In Cochrane reviews, we're using adaptations of grade. So the certainty of the network as a whole and of the comparisons you're going to focus on and what that means. And that can be as simple as saying, this is low certainty. Our conclusions may change substantially if new evidence becomes available. If you were able to identify treatments which seem likely to be best, and that's not always a given, sometimes rankograms in our area can look very, very unclear, then pick that out with any important caveats. And perhaps in wounds research, there is always caveats about the quality of the evidence and how reliable it might be. And then a very brief summary of what your take-home message is. Other media to think about in relation to this that are available through Cochrane. You have to do a plain language summary. Now, that is supposed to be the same length as a podcast, 400 words. I have never yet managed to write a plain language summary in 400 words, but you have up to 700. So you have a little bit more scope there. Cochrane blogshots are a really interesting way of disseminating work to people who perhaps don't have very much time, and they're extremely short, under 100 words. Evidently, Cochrane blogs are great as a means of disseminating a network meta-analysis because you have the space and the freedom to use figures, which you don't have in the other media. But for all of these, your audiences are likely to include or to be entirely comprised of non-methodologists. So it's very important to apply the same principles as you would with the podcast. This is an example of a blog shot of a different NMA to the one we did the podcast on. And this was developed by Sarah Chapman, who is the Cochrane knowledge broker. And it's brilliantly concise. There are 50 words here at most. There was no clear evidence, and she boils that down while saying there's a lot of people in trials, but actually we don't know. If you're considering doing a blog shot, I cannot give better advice than to consult Sarah or someone like her. When you're writing your plain language summary, this is compulsory with a Cochrane review, and the structure is also given to you, which supports that focus on the points you would use in a podcast. And it also comes with the built-in feature of consumer peer review at the end of it. But I would really recommend, with any complicated review, and particularly with an NMA, getting non-specialist input into the writing, because it really forces you to focus on what the meaning of your evidence is, rather than resisting the temptation to get bogged down in the detail of the methodology. And again, we've been quite successful in getting people who are authors with the group, but are not methodologists, to have some input here as a balance of what a clinician would want to know and an understanding of reviews. Finally, blogging an NMA. Evidently, Cochrane, as I've said, is a really great place to be able to do this. And again, you would have access to specialist support in dissemination from someone like Sarah, and all the same messages apply, but with the big benefit that you can put some figures in. And we've just seen the, some of the brilliant options that Andrea was presenting. There are a myriad of things you could do there that would help to support your text. 1,000 words gives you more space, but it's still not a huge amount. So if you can lean on those figures, I think that can be enormously helpful. But I would come back to the same point that Andrea was making, which is focus on the clinical relevance. In our case, what should a nurse who is a tissue viability specialist take away from the work you have done? And what is the relevance of that to existing guidelines from NICE and so on? And I think at this point, I just thank everybody who has worked with me, but especially Maggie Westby and Joe Danville, who've been co-authors on all of these and the editorial base of Cochrane Learning. And I couldn't be more grateful to Sarah Chapman for her support. And this is my funding declaration. Basically, I'm funded by NIHR in myriad forms over the years, and I'm very grateful to them. And these are just some links that people might find helpful to the different media I've been talking about and to the reviews that they were based on. Thank you very much.